You bought it.
I don't have a union card for that. Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to say how pleased I am to be in State College, semi-permanently for the semester. Teaching this semester as a visiting professor of practice, and I'm teaching two courses, one on collective bargaining and post-course, and a seminar on the American labor movement. And it is such a pleasure to be temporarily part of the faculty of this great department, and to be associated with the faculty, staff, graduate students and undergraduate students that are affiliated with the Labor Studies and Employment Relations Department, which is a growing and dynamic department that it's great for me to be able to see from the inside, as I've admired it and supported it so long as an alum. I've done that as Paul said, as a board member of the affiliated program group, which is an alumni group that provides mentorship and support for students in a variety of ways, internships, and alumni come back to the university and participate in programs with the students. It's been a great experience to be part of a growing group of alumni that have done that for now 15 years, and we've got about our third generation of alumni. It's fun now to see some of the students we worked with when we first started the group are active alumni members and taking over the leadership positions on that board, and that's terrific. We're really proud of the Human Resources and Employment Relations graduate program, which is fairly new, certainly new since we started the alumni group, and it's been great to watch that grow and become so successful. And I know we have some of the graduate students here tonight. Believe me, we're so blessed to have this graduate program be one of the pillars of this department, and so it's been great to watch that. And I can't say enough about our success as a department in the online program, which has exploded and is extraordinarily popular. And I've had the pleasure of being able to teach in that program, and will tell you, any of you that don't know much about it, it's an extraordinary program where you can get an undergraduate or graduate degree from this department entirely online, and it's a very rigorous program. The degree you get from Penn State is the same degree you get in residence, and that's completely justified. As somebody who's taught courses in that program, I can tell you how rigorous and difficult it is, appropriately, to do well when you're a student. It's part of the world campus at Penn State University, which is regarded as the finest online university in the country, and I would submit in the world. So it's been a real honor to be part of that, and to be here in residence for the semester. Amy Dietz, who most of you know, I'm sure, instructed me, gave me specific instructions to sprinkle a few Hollywood stories in my remarks, so that's fine with me. I talk a lot about what's going on in professional sports, and poor Jessica Weaver, if I did that tonight, would have heard it for the 4th time this week. So I'll spend a little more time on Hollywood than I normally do. But it's an interesting time in professional sports, not only the lockout and the new CBA and the decertification effort of NFL players in football, but as we sit here, there's a lockout going on in the NBA that you literally have to pay attention to minute by minute to see what's happening. And one of the fascinating things to watch is the different way the Players Association and the NBA has dealt with the antitrust and labor law issues as opposed to the NFL Players Association, which twice in its history now has decertified as a way to expose the owners to antitrust challenge by the players. The NBA players have so far chosen not to do that, despite the fact that there's a group of agents that represent NBA superstars that are pushing the union leadership to do exactly that. So far, the union leadership in the NBA the MBPA, has relied on labor law and has resisted the lockout as their primary source of leverage. So we're all keeping an eye on that. And one of my tenets in the class I've been teaching is that the best way to evaluate labor relations is to look at, in the case of the union and management representatives, how they address leadership, leverage, and resources, and needing all three of those elements to be effective in order to accomplish something at the collective bargaining table. And this has again been an interesting year to watch professional sports in that regard, because the Major League Baseball Players Association has got a collective bargaining agreement that expires in December, and they have a brand new executive director. This will be the first time that, as the executive director, he's negotiated a new agreement, although he's been with the union a long time as one of their counsel. The reason he's the new executive director is the old executive director, who was Don Fear, retired, but almost immediately was hired by the NHL Players Association to be their executive director. So this year we have the NFL Players Association executive director is new and negotiated for the first time. The NHL Players Association executive director is not new to the profession, but is new to the hockey players. And the baseball players executive director is not new to the MLBPA, but he's certainly new to being in the driver's seat of the negotiation. So if leadership is something that is one of the three legs of the collective bargaining stool, there's a lot of leadership. There's a musical chairs going on in professional sports. And in the NFL, at least, that also happened on the other side of the table, because the commissioner of the National Football League, Roger Goodell, isn't brand new, but this is the first time he negotiated as the lead negotiator for the owners in the position as commissioner. He's a lifetime employee of the NFL. He came there as an intern out of college, and he was Charlie Goodell's the senator from New York's son. That may have helped him some when he got his internship. But he's been with the NFL for a long time, and this was the first negotiation. I think that speaking about athletes unions and actors unions, it's important to remember that they do many of the same things that the unions do that you are affiliated with or deal with in your work life. They organize new members, educate members on the issues, and involve them in their workplace democracy. They negotiate wages, hours, and working conditions, just like your unions or the unions you deal with do. There are some differences. One of the likely differences from your experience is that entertainment and sports unions negotiate minimum salaries, and agents and their clients, as players or athletes, negotiate compensation above that and improved working conditions, so long as what they negotiate doesn't subtract from the guarantees that are in the collective bargaining agreement. And structurally, they're different. At least the two I worked for, and certainly any sports union, there aren't any locals. Even in the Screen Actors Guild, which has 120,000 members, there are 3 regions, but they don't negotiate separate collective bargaining agreements. That's all done. The negotiation and the administration and the grievance procedure is all done nationally. And the regions are really for governance purposes and not for collective bargaining. So there are no locals. And that's certainly true of the NFLPA and the other sports unions. They're national locals, and there are no layers between the member in the locker room and the union headquarters, as opposed to large national unions that you may be familiar with, where there's locals and districts and statewide organizations before you get to the national. And sometimes bargaining is done on a national basis, but often it's done local by local, or it's done a combination of both. That's not what happens in sports or most of entertainment. Having said that, I think it's axiomatic that athletes and actors need the collective strength of their unions to be treated fairly. There is, and I've said this to my class, there is, despite the internal fights and fierce management opposition that comes up periodically, those unions are like cockroaches. They're hard to kill. The reason I think that's true is the insecurity of the profession, whether you're talking about Hollywood or sports, where there's more rejection than there is work, and more people interested in the work than there are opportunities, and where you're only as good as your last performance. That's true of professional athletes and professional actors. And I've seen this psychology among athletes and actors, where they have enormous doubt in their future or their ability. Even established actors. I got to be good friends with Ed Asner, who was at one time the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and was still on the board when I was the national executive director. And he's a real character. But he told me that no matter how many times he got a job, and he had a very successful movie and television career, when he was unemployed in between jobs, he was always sure that that was the last time he was going to work, that he had worked his last job in his 40s, in his 30s, in his 50s, and he's in his 80s now. He had that view, and I thought perhaps when I first met Ed that was something that was unique to him, but I heard that over and over again, even from actors like Warren Beatty or Jack Nicholson, which sounds preposterous, but when you think about it, there have been a lot of famous actors that who have long dry spells in their career. The other thing that people misunderstand about actors is even if they've made a substantial amount of money, they're typically not all rich the same way. Particularly actors that are older, if they're well off, often have become well off through investments rather than their career. And if they were wise when they had TV success in the 60s or 70s and invested their money well, they're fine. If they didn't, they typically aren't nearly as wealthy as people think they are, even younger actors than Ed Asner. But I think it's important to relate that to sports, because that kind of insecurity is certainly typical of NFL players. If you've ever watched Hard Knocks on TV, you know how precarious the football profession is and how susceptible it is to injury and to the turnover that happens, which is 25% a year in the National Football League. And there's a fresh crop of new players coming in that you have to beat out to keep your job every year. In Hollywood, it's more a function of how short the production life of a particular project is. And once that movie's over, you have to go find another movie or a TV series in order to continue to work as an actor. Now, one reaction in Hollywood to that problem by actors creates enormous difficulty for the union. And I certainly faced that at the Screen Actors Guild, because as a way to deal with that insecurity and that periodic unemployment, some really well-known actors leverage their celebrity and the peak of their career to become producers. In essence, employers owning and producing the projects that they act in. And that's true of actors like George Clooney or Tom Hanks or Sandra Bullock, to name a few. They're mini studios, and they produce movies and manage the enterprise that owns and produces the movie. And to relate it to sports, it would be as if quarterbacks owned the football team they played on. Or to put it in basketball terms, it would be as if LeBron James owned the Miami Heat, which in neither case could happen given the constitutional rules in those leagues, but it happens all the time in sports. And I ran into that problem personally when a group of Hollywood superstars, including George Clooney and Tom Hanks and Robert De Niro, ran ads in the Hollywood trades in 2008 when I was running the union and in charge of bargaining, questioning our leadership and bargaining strategy, long before our agreement was up. And while we were engaged in a contract campaign in advance of bargaining and the CBA's expiration. So one night I found myself in Mark Helgenberger's living room. She was married to, at the time, to Alan Rosenberg, who was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And I was there with Anne Marie Johnson, who's a really well-known television actor who was on In the Heat of the Night for years, and Elliot Gould, and the secretary-treasurer of the union, who at the time was Connie Stevens. We were there to meet with Sally Field and Rob Lowe and Tom Hanks and George Clooney and Joe Pantoliano. And after this meeting, I called my wife and said, you know, on occasion my life has been fairly difficult, but it has certainly never been boring, and tonight is an example of that. That was a surreal evening. George Clooney was really furious coming into that living room, and with me, even though he'd never met me, because I had led SAG in the support of the Writers Guild strike, which I think at the time of that meeting was still going on. He was upset, as particularly Hanks was, that we weren't meeting with the studio heads and hadn't reached agreement yet in our bargaining. And I pointed out to both of them that Alan and I had met with Bob Iger and Barry Meyer, who was Bob Iger from Disney, and Barry Meyer, who was the head of Warner Brothers, and Peter Chernin, who was the head of Fox, but we had done it privately and we hadn't talked about it. And he sounded skeptical, as if we would lie to him about that, as if you could lie about that and not be found out. It was a really strange, accusatory kind of confrontational discussion. I was surprised by how vitriolic it was. I'll explain why that was in a minute, why it was vitriolic. But so George, who was very agitated, suggested that we hold a press conference the next day and tell everybody that we've been meeting with the studio presidents. And I said, well, that's not a great idea, because as soon as we do that, it'll be the last time that we ever meet with a studio president, because none of them are ever going to do that if we go out and talk about it publicly. Those meetings were all taking place informally and in private, with an understanding that nobody would talk about what was discussed outside of the room. And that was because the bargaining in Hollywood is done on a multi-employer bargaining basis by a group called the AMPTP, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. And so it would be inappropriate for a studio head, even though on that AMPTP committee, it's their senior vice president for labor relations that sits on the committee, and that person works for them. It would be inappropriate for them to talk about bargaining publicly. It would be a violation of the a multi-employer bargaining representation agreement that they have with each other. It would be like an NFL team owner who spouts off about bargaining and isn't authorized to do that. And sometimes that's happened, and those people have been fined. I pointed out to mostly it was George Clooney and Tom Hanks that were upset. I pointed out to them that we had a Screen Actors Guild constitutional requirement that we engage in a process called wages and working conditions. That we were required by the Constitution of the Union to go to the membership and give them the opportunity to come to meetings and to talk to SAG elected leaders and staff about what they wanted to see done in bargaining and what they wanted to see done differently in the collective bargaining agreement. And we had a requirement to do that over a period of time before we put formal demands on the table, which is one of the reasons why we weren't talking formally to the studio heads. We were speaking very informally, and they understood that we had that process to go through before we could say anything officially, and anything that they could rely on as a demand from the union. And I said, you know, it would be a good idea, Tom and George, if you would drop by one of these meetings in Hollywood, because they take place all over the country, but the majority of the members come to the meetings in Hollywood, to show their support for their fellow actors. And this was Hanks said dismissively, with derision dripping from the words, he said, you know, Doug, I don't really care, and he sounded a little bit like Jack Nicholson when he said it, which was kind of odd. He said, I don't really care if we have styrofoam or paper cups at craft services. You know what I mean? And what he meant by that was, from his perspective, the things we were talking about in bargaining were at that level. We were talking about what extras got out of craft services and what the rules were. And I said, well, that's one issue, but sometimes we talk about things even more important than that, Tom. And it was that kind of a conversation the whole evening. Frankly, I was stunned by how different his person was from his film persona. And a light bulb went off in my head, and I realized that one of the problems in this conversation was I thought I was talking to a couple of actors, when what I was really talking to was a couple of producers, employers. And they weren't there to argue with us about whether our strategy was correct and appropriate as actors. They were there to protect the series of 20 films that they each had in production, Clooney and Hanks particularly. That is a real problem in the entertainment industry. Fortunately, we don't have that problem in sports because you're not allowed to play on a team and own a franchise. But in Hollywood, that's pretty much the norm. That when you become well-known and have leverage, what you do is, and I understand why people do that. So I'm not suggesting that that's inappropriate for somebody to do that has the opportunity to do it. But they stop being a representative member and an actor as part of the union. And it was particularly ironic because Hanks had been on the first Screen Actors Guild Awards show when he was a young actor. I think it was for the movie Philadelphia. And he was on the show when he got the award, and he held up his SAG card and said, this card is the only reason I got to be an actor. And fast forward 15 or so years later, and his attitude about what the union should be doing was very different. The other big problem for the Screen Actors Guild, and I think this is what was motivating Clooney's vitriol, is a 50-year battle between two political parties fighting to control the union. They seesaw back and forth between, there's sort of a progressive wing and a more conservative wing. And they seesaw back and forth in terms of control of the leadership. When each is in the minority, they do everything they can to prevent the other party in SAG from succeeding as the majority. They refuse to go along with anything that makes sense, wanting only to defeat the other party in the next election. Wait a minute, that sounds good. Anyway, when the party that didn't hire me took the majority a couple of years after they did, it wasn't too long before my contract was terminated, although certainly without cause. And I didn't take it personally. My successor was the 8th Screen Actors Guild executive director in 10 years. So it's a large cult. But I bring this up not in a cynical or pessimistic way. I love that job, and I would do it again in a minute. I had a great staff, and they're sort of like abused family members in terms of the way this revolving door has treated them, and the fact that most of them have hung in there and done a great job serving their members is really admirable. They're the secret weapon of that union and the thing that's holding it together. And I really loved working with them. They were a great bunch. And we got a lot done in a short time, actually. And that's one of the reasons I don't regret doing it. One of the things I'm most proud of is we got the first pension benefit improvement in 9 years. And pension benefits are really important to working actors because many of them, there's a whole group of them that are middle class folks that make between $50,000 and $75,000 a year in a good year, and earn a living as an actor, but barely. That's the heart and soul of that union. Every once in a while, they might pop up above that group and do better, but then many times they'll spend years in that same salary range. So even people you recognize and would say are very familiar to you from television, particularly. Are not getting rich off of acting, and that's why the union is so important. And in my view, if somebody like Ed Asner needs a union, and somebody like Jack Nicholson needs a union, and somebody like Peyton Manning and Drew Brees need a union because of that insecurity and because of the fact that the temptation to play for nothing is so great when your passion for performing is all-consuming, and you have to make the team or be cast in the production over and over and over and over again. It's certainly important even with the dysfunctional democracy that's in place, to value that and to encourage it. And I certainly wish them well, and actors particularly deserve a union that's functional and productive for them. And I've always, one of the conclusions I've always drawn from my career is that people like Peyton Manning need a union, and people like Jack Nicholson need a union. And certainly those are democratic workplace voice institutions that the police officer or the nurse in the emergency room, or the teacher in the school, or the auto worker dealing with the problems in the auto industry, or the service employees worker, or the busboy in this hotel need the opportunity, together with their workmates, to decide democratically whether they want a union, and if they make that decision, to have representatives speak for them in the workplace. You know, it's always struck me as odd that we don't teach workplace democracy in our elementary and high schools anymore. We honor it in our sort of symbolic and mythological history, but we don't spend enough time honoring it in everyday life. And I don't mean that because they're democracies, unions are always perfect institutions. They're not. But the democracy they have, particularly when it's rigorously enforced, as it should be, by the law, is remarkably self-healing, and it can remediate problems like corruption or inefficiency, or even the kind of dysfunctionality that you see at a place like the Screen Actors Guild. They're remarkably resilient organizations, and one of the reasons I'm very happy to be here tonight is to speak to an organization that respects and acknowledges their contribution. That there is something of value on both sides of the table when you have labor relations in this country, and that's something we should all remember. Anyway, thank you very much for having me here.